Welcome, everybody. My name is Nina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I see some people from other places, Phoenix and Tewksbury and everywhere. So I want to make sure that we're centered on where we are. I'm in Ashland. We're talking about New Orleans with T.R. Johnson, who's going to be talking about the writer city of New Orleans. But before we get to him, I just want to say a couple things. One is that I like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. We could not do it without them. And also I'd like to thank TR for letting us partner with other libraries. As I said, several libraries are working together to make this program a success. And when libraries work together, we make magic. It's pretty awesome. So I'd like to welcome, obviously, the patrons from Ashland, but also from Needham, Marlborough, Spencer, Marston Mills, and Woburn. So I'm very glad that you all are here. You can buy a signed copy of TR's book from Aesop's Fable. I will put that link in the chat, and you're welcome to do that anytime for this program in the next couple days. TR is going to be talking for like maybe 10-15 minutes, but unlike our other program, which we talked about Dublin, where TR and I are just going to have a conversation. So feel free to put questions into the Q&A and I will moderate them. Or if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. Although it's better for me to have them in the Q&A because it's a little bit easier for me to follow. So, but feel free to use the chat to chat away about anything, New Orleans, writers, food, beignets, whatever, we're good. So again, T.R. Johnson is a professor of English at Tulane University in Boston, not Boston, we're in Boston, in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And we're very thrilled to be here because he's written this book called New Orleans, a writer's place, writer's city. And so we're going to learn all about authors who have been influenced by New Orleans. So welcome, TR. Let's hear something about you that I obviously did not get to in my introduction, and then about the book.
Sure, certainly. Well, it's funny when you made the slip of the tongue saying I was in Boston. Ironically, I used to teach in Boston. I was a professor at Boston University in the late 90s and was there for about 2 years, but then got a job offer here in New Orleans. And being a music nut and knowing that at BU, they weren't tenuring people in my division. So I know I needed to kind of like keep moving. And the opportunity opened up for me in New Orleans. And so I zoomed on down here about 1999. So I've been in the city about 24 years, but moved here from Central Square, Cambridge, just right on the Charles River. I would walk through that neighborhood, I'm blank, Cambridgeport, and walk over the BU bridge to teach at BU. And so I have memories of some very cold and chilly mornings walking across that bridge to teach my classes. It's been over 100 degrees here every day for about a week. And so I kind of have a sentimental fondness of a sub-zero walk across that bridge. I wouldn't mind it right now. In any case, but I tell people I've moved from just outside Harvard Square to just outside Congo Square in 1999. And that's about as perfect and complete a cultural 180 as you can do in the continental United States. Harvard Square being at the epicenter of a certain kind of power and authority in the United States. Congo Square here in New Orleans being another kind of power and authority that is a kind of anchor of the culture of the United States, commonly understood to be the place where African-American music began. And that is a serious thing. So I've been in New Orleans since 1999. I guess Katrina came in 2005. And I guess what I would like to do is sort of explain sort of where this book came from, and then how I sort of set it up and structured it, what's a little bit surprising and unique about it, how it sort of differs from a lot of books of its kind about New Orleans. And then some of what my sort of hopes are for this book, what I'm ultimately trying to accomplish with it. And then, of course, we'll go to Q&A. Well, right after Katrina was 2005, I had a senior colleague in the Department of English at Tulane who had been teaching a class called Literary New Orleans. He was ready to retire. And the chair of the department said, "Hey, TR, we know that you're really into New Orleans. Would you like to take over this class?" And I thought, wow, I don't have any special training in this stuff. I have no special expertise in this stuff, but I'd love this to have the excuse to really do this immersion and pull this class together. The class had been a fairly traditional kind of class where you looked at canonical literature. It was Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, Walker Percy's Moviegoer, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, maybe Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, maybe one or two other kind of contemporary things to plug in. It would vary from year to year, but it hadn't really changed a lot in a long, long time. And so, and my colleague, a wonderful guy, had been teaching the class for, gosh, 40 plus years this way. And so I was sort of stepping into a venerable institution, as it were, in this class. And I knew I wanted to sort of shake it up a little bit. And in the aftermath of Katrina, there was just this really vivid and intense sense of what we were poised to lose here culturally. And being a music nut, I kind of wanted to start weaving in musicians' memoirs and find ways to put to bring sort of voices of color into the mix, because to be in the city is to be surrounded all the time by Black culture, in the simplest, to put it in the simplest terms. And yet the traditional literary canon had not typically represented that. And so that was sort of became my my curiosity, is how to really mix this up and diversify this reading list in ways to become true to my experience of the city, particularly my experience of the city, as I say, as a music nut. I'm a jazz disc jockey, I should add, at the community radio station here in New Orleans. It's called WWOZ, and it's kind of a national treasure for people who are into the various generations of R&B and jazz and so on. So I've been doing that for 20 years. It's kind of my other identity here in the city besides English professor. So that was sort of informing how I was teaching the class. Well, fast forward about 10 years, I've been teaching the class a solid 10 years, maybe 12, when an editor from Cambridge University Press was sort of visiting Tulane, and he was asking around like, hey, who teaches the New Orleans stuff? Because I'm interested in publishing a book about the literary history of the city. Well, everybody said, go talk to TR. I said, hey, we sat down and talked, and he said, look, what I want to do is publish a collection of essays that you would edit, that would be a comprehensive history of the city's literature. I said, I'll do it. You know, this was spring of 2017. And so I went ahead and found kind of leading experts in these various topics within the history of the city's literature and solicited essays from them. Ultimately, that book came out in October of 2019, a couple of years ago now, 4 years ago now. And it was 26 essays by leading academics, specifically about the particular moments that shaped the world's understanding of this place. And so there's a real range of stuff, and I really enjoyed it, and I really learned a lot from it, and was really inspired. I nominated myself, of course, to have the final word. Big surprise. And so I wrote the final essay in the book that kind of really drills down into the contemporary scene, but understands kind of the 20th century and 21st century together around this great anxiety about what New Orleans is facing vis-a-vis climate change, and the idea that this unimaginable jewel of a hemispheric cultural hub or cultural capital is going to be lost. Not maybe quite in our lifetime, but 50 years, 75 years, I don't think it'll be here. It will be unrecognizable, I would think, in 30 or 40 years, and it won't exist at all in 75 or 100. And this horrifying reality shaped what I wrote in that essay. Well, it was so it came together very nicely. I was very satisfied with it. The people at Cambridge really loved it. In January of 2020, about 6 weeks before the big shutdown, I hosted a symposium. I organized a symposium here at Tulane with all the contributors from the book. I think I got 20 of the 26 contributors to come. We made different panels around different sort of thematic clusters and so on. And we talked all day about the literary history of the city. Had a huge turnout from the city. It was a wonderful, crazy, great all-day sort of intellectual party in this big room in Tulane's campus. We had, I think, 4 panels, a keynote speaker. It was a great time. Well, the response was so intense that Cambridge came back to me and said, look, TR, we want you to do another book, this time not an edited collection of academic essays, but rather a monograph, just all you. Take that final essay of that edited collection that you wrote, stretch that to book length, just do it in your own voice, your own way, not strictly academic, and let's aim to make this a trade book, something that will interest a general reader, something that we can, you know, sell a bunch of, and that could be a kind of a really radically updated and contemporary vision of the city, in contrast to the kind of shop-worn cliches about the city that first emerged right after the Civil War and then got codified in the 1940s for the sort of the modern tourist industry. It's really time for an upgrade. And so that's what I set about doing. Given our new ways of thinking and talking with a certain kind of urgency about race and the climate emergency that's bearing down on us, there's an absolute need to talk about New Orleans in an up-to-date way. It's not just Mardi Gras and beads and beer and what have you. It's a lot. And I think after Katrina, the world came to know that the cultural riches here are staggering. Architectural, musical, culinary, it's incredible. What a lot of people don't realize is the role literature has played in building the legend, the aura, the world's imagination of this place. New Orleans, as I say, it's one of the most storied cities in the world. It occupies a singular place in the human imagination. And that comes from all kinds of sources, but great writers are playing a huge role in making that happen. So what I did was, I said, I'm going to organize this book. It's a city of neighborhoods. And through these neighborhoods, there tends to be a major thoroughfare that anchors the neighborhood. So each chapter is devoted to a different street. And not just the street, but the street as a kind of corridor for a whole part of town and a whole cultural legacy. So I use Royal Street to talk about the French Quarter. That's chapter 1. In chapter 2, I come down into the Ninth Ward. It's all focused around St. Claude Avenue to do the downriver sort of working class neighborhoods of the Ninth Ward and the lower Ninth. The next chapter, chapter 3, is all about Esplanade Avenue, which is the old core, it was the old literal highway, meaning high path, out of, through the swamps and out of the city. It's how you get from the old French Quarter out into the big thoroughfares to connect you to Baton Rouge or into the Midwest and so on. Literally a highway. And so it has a considerable role in the imagination of the city, the literature of the city. Next stop, chapter 4, is Basin Street. Storyville, the Treme, Congo Square are the kind of primary hubs around Basin. Next chapter, the 5th chapter, is St. Charles Avenue, the Garden District, the University District, the Irish Channel, Central City, where all the hip hop comes from these days. And then there's a final chapter I call Outskirts, where I kind of cast a wide net along the kind of swampy margins of the city that turn out to be very, very important, especially right now, to the city's literary history. So that's how the book is set up. Streets are a kind of, on one hand, they are sort of monuments in that they've been there for a long time and anchor and focus the movements of the population. And yet they have a completely sort of workaday reality where people sort of jostle together and hang out and interact. And so they become kind of major arteries, if you will, of whole dimensions of the city. And they have a character. St. Claude is very different from Royal. Esplanade is yet a different thing altogether. Basin is the mythical, there's a jazz standard, Basin Street Blues, the land of dreamy dreams, da-da-da-da-da, where the black and the white folk meet, a jazz standard. St. Charles is the legendary corridor of the quote-unquote American district that was kind of late developing vis-a-vis the others here in New Orleans, but is where American money kind of roared to life down here in the aftermath of kind of the Creole periods of the city. So that's how the book is set up. The other thing I did that's a little bit unique is I really wanted to shine a light on stuff that is, or that has been enormously important, but that is kind of forgotten about today. So, for example, in the St. Charles chapter, I start off by talking about Lillian Hellman, a giant of the American theater scene from the late 30s to the late 70s. 40 years, she was a central presence on Broadway and in sort of the New York literary scene, and her roots are all in uptown New Orleans, but nobody talks about her today. She was blackballed during the McCarthy hearings, had a very dicey experience of Joe McCarthy. It did not play well with the uptown elites, for reasons that are not hard to figure out. And so today, you never hear Lillian Hellman's name in this city. She's unknown. There's no historical marker. There's nothing. This is a person who won the National Book Award, I think twice, was a giant of the New York stage, compared to Ibsen and Chekhov, some of her plays. A astounding figure, a woman of incredible courage. She, at the height of World War II, she took a train to the Eastern Front of World War II to talk to Russians there, and came back. She was Jewish. Imagine riding a train. It's inconceivable. It's inconceivable. This is an astounding woman who is unknown in New Orleans today. And so I really wanted to shine a light on her career. Bob Kaufman, there's a street named after him in San Francisco. In France, he's called the Black Rimbaud. Today here, nobody talks about him. He left here right after high school, never really came back. And even though he is a central figure of the beatnik era, in fact, is credited with coining the term beatnik, and a central figure of San Francisco through the 60s, very important place and time, a giant of the West Coast and of the beatnik scene, a giant of 20th century surrealist literature. Again, he's not known. He's full of a kind of, once you've lived in New Orleans for a while, and then you read his stuff, you see how much carnival and the surrealism of carnival is shaping his aesthetics. I would say the same thing about William Burroughs's Naked Lunch. Once you've been to the Mardi Gras, you read Burroughs's Naked Lunch in a very new way. You see that Mardi Gras shaped what he was doing. Carnival in the broadest sense of the world upside down, hierarchies inverted, but also just the kind of surreal sort of giant insects and type. You see that on Mardi Gras routinely, and it shows up in Naked Lunch. So that was the kind of the thing I did. My biggest coup on this count, shining a light on stuff that's kind of unknown, I found a lost Toni Morrison manuscript. She, right before she wrote Beloved, she was writing a Broadway musical called Storyville, the New Orleans Musical. Excuse me, New Orleans, that's Storyville, the New Orleans Musical. It never got performed. It never got published. It just ended up in her papers, badly damaged in a fire at her house in the 90s. But about 150 pages of it remain readable. It's in an archive at Princeton. In the depths of the pandemic, the library was closed. I guess they didn't have anything to do. They were kind enough to make a PDF of the whole thing and email it to me. And so I was able to start my Basin Street chapter discussing a Toni Morrison manuscript that is essentially unknown. And that was,
can I just interrupt you for a second? Because now I'm like, oh my God.
yeah, that's what I said.
How do you find something like that? Like, how did you know it even existed?
It's a great question. I would call it a miracle. That would be my term for it, miracle. Here's how it happened. It's preposterous. I knew that Toni Morrison was visiting New Orleans in the early 70s. I knew that from some Black intellectuals who, in their memoirs and in conversations, talked about her and Ishmael Reed coming to New Orleans at Mardi Gras in the early 70s and running around doing Black Carnival, the Zulu Club, the Indians, Congo Square, with these local leaders of the Black arts movement, Kalamu Yasalam, most pointedly, but also a guy named Tom Dent. So, and James Baldwin was in town a whole lot in that period too, to visit those two guys and the kind of literary workshops and writers groups that they were creating. And so Toni Morrison was here. So I knew that she was here. And I was just curious. I thought to myself, it had to have made an impression on her, like, to be here doing Black Carnival in the early 70s, it had to have made an impression on her. And so get this, Google is quite a thing, quite a gizmo. I was typing Toni Morrison, New Orleans into a Google search pane, and I had some other, because there's never been an authoritative biography of Morrison. We don't know her life in minute detail. Hopefully someone will do that soon. Anyway, I typed it up and my finger hit the return key before I had formulated a more elaborate question that would have thrown me off trail. I would have led to nothing. I hit the key too soon, and up popped an article from the New York Times about 1981. It said, Toni Morrison, she was not yet a superstar. She was on her way, but Beloved hadn't happened yet. Bluest Eye had, and Sula and Tar Baby had happened. But so it was sort of news of Broadway. It says Toni Morrison has a new script that is being workshopped, and they expect to go into rehearsals in a few months. And I'm reading this thing thinking, well, that's the damnedest thing I ever, and it's called Storyville, the New Orleans Musical. I thought, this is really curious. I happen to know from a friend that all of her papers are held at Princeton. So I got on the Princeton library site, started searching around, and by gosh, in the Morrison archive, there is a manila envelope with about 150. This is the crazy part of it. The edges of these pieces of paper are flame charred. They barely saved this manuscript from the fire. The PDF on my machine, it's incredible. The flames just stopped at the edges of, because it's like a script. Everything is written in the middle. It's centered on the screen. Thank God, because it goes in 1.5 inches, the fire. And so I'm looking at this PDF, and the edges are just swirling black fire debris, but I could read the center of the page, 150 pages of it, basically the completed manuscript. It's 26 separate lyrics with stage directions. I don't know what happened with this thing. It never got produced. It never got published. She just put it away because she got consumed with a new project, which became Beloved. And so I sometimes think the incredible lyricism of Beloved grows out of her writing literal lyrics about Storyville just before that. And that the manuscript, the themes, it's preoccupied with Black memory. And this becomes the theme of that whole chapter for me. Each of these parts of town has a theme. Memory and music is my Basin Street chapter theme. And so I start with her and sort of tease out the way this manuscript is all about music and memory. Specifically, Sidney Bechet, the great jazz artist of the very early days, said, coming out of enslavement, we made this music because we found that it was a way of remembering that was even better than forgetting. A way, what we, in modern terms, healing from trauma was how we would think about it, I think, in contemporary terms. So she took that idea and built this musical around it, and then put it in a drawer, forgot about it, wrote Beloved. The fire nearly took it from us. But I start off chapter 4 with about a 5 to 6 page sort of, here's what's there, here's what it's about, here's what I think of it. And this leads into a whole discussion of Congo Square, Storyville, and Treme. Each of these, so the Royal Street chapter is based around the theme of masks. St. Claude is about poverty and, oddly enough, good children. Esplanade is about dreams of escape. St. Charles, I call it blood and money. And the outskirts is about writing through loss, because this is all where the ravages of Katrina have shaped life out there in the most fundamental way. So that's what I did, and let's go to questions.
Just what really quickly, somebody asks, did you write about any good fiction that came because of Katrina, from Katrina?
Oh, I do, absolutely, I do, especially in that last chapter. Maurice Carlos Ruffin is a major new fiction writer who is explicitly and thoroughly a post-Katrina writer whose life was upended by Katrina. There are some poets also who are profoundly shaped by Katrina, and they're very young. There's also a brilliant new young nonfiction writer named Clint Smith. And these are all people who are, we call them around here, something we call them Katrina babies. They were kids when Katrina happened, and now they're 25, 30, maybe 40 at the oldest, one of them. But they are all people whose entire life trajectory into adulthood was shaped indelibly by Katrina, and their dazzling literary achievement is fundamentally informed by Katrina. So Maurice Carlos Ruffin, Clint Smith, Charisma Price, Sky Jackson, these are all stunning new voices that are explicitly emerging from the ruins of Katrina.
So one of the things that you and I had spoken about before we started the talk was that one of your chapters is about masks, and we talked about a little bit about Carnival and how does that influence the writers in New Orleans in terms of the symbols and the metaphors that can come out of that?
Sure. Well, it's a huge thing. My Royal Street chapter, this is the chapter on the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, the old part of town, the original city. This place, in the old days, very explicitly, was a sort of paradoxical frontier capital. It was a capital of the old frontier. That is to say, people figured out that the soil of the Mississippi Delta was impossibly rich. The farming and plantations that were going to spring up on those things were going to be enormously valuable, but they needed labor to do that work. There was an abundance of slaves on the East Coast. I'm talking about 18th century, very early 19th century. And as New Orleans began to boom in the early 19th century, there was this huge migration of Black labor through this city, through the auction houses of the city, to go up into the Delta to work those plantations. The rise of the slave markets here were a scene for white enslavers of incredible self-fashioning. There's a brilliant Harvard historian named Walter Johnson, who's written a great book called Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market, where he talks about the way white people were self-fashioning, self-inventing, cultivating a fantasy of who they could be. If they just had the right kinds of slaves and the right number of slaves, they could be on their way. And so this also, the idea that we're kind of, in those days, out here in the middle of nowhere, but a major population center in the middle of nowhere, meant that there were no kind of background checks, if you will, meaning people could kind of be who they wanted to be. You could insert a DE before your last name, and suddenly, I'm the Duchess of you know, I'm European royalty, washed up out here in the middle of nowhere in the, you know, in the chaos of imperial Europe's expansion and contraction. It could be, you know, they weren't at all. They were just some rough and tumble backwoods folks who came in here and decided, I can be who I want to be. If I get the money and I got the attitude, who's to say I'm not the Duchess of blah, blah, blah. And this is essentially what Faulkner's Absalom is about. A brilliant and profoundly ambitious tragedy about a man whose efforts to turn himself into landed gentry and ascend to the kind of the highest kinds of power in the old plantation South is hinging on a kind of vicious othering of women and people of color that is ultimately his undoing. This is Faulkner's arguably greatest masterpiece, I think, and it's very much a novel of masquerading through the French Quarter by way of building a certain kind of identity up on the Delta. And so this governs, while it sounds like a kind of early 19th century phenomenon, the French Quarter continues to be a place for people to self-reinvent up, I would say, certainly into the 50s and 60s, if not even a little bit beyond that, as a very complex, very cosmopolitan, very densely populated place where anything goes, where there was effectively not really a government per se. It became just very tolerant, and you could kind of be who you wanted to be. Very attractive, therefore, to gay people. Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, William March, and then later John Ritchie in the 60s. A major queer literature of New Orleans roars to life in the Quarter, really from the 1920s to the 1960s. That huge bohemian scene around Faulkner here in the city in the 20s, 2/3 of the people in that community were, in the terminology of the time, confirmed bachelors. This is a function, it was kind of like what San Francisco became to the West Coast. This is what New Orleans became to the Deep South. One part of it. Also, just women who wanted to live very independently. This is what Kate Chopin's The Awakening is about. Catherine Ann Porter came here. It's a place to do your own thing. And it'd be also, I'll wrap it up with this, a lot of political revolutionaries from Latin America, when things got too dicey for them in their home countries, be it Nicaragua, Jamaica, other places, Mexico, they would come here and hang out here for a year, 5 years, even a decade, kind of planning and plotting and organizing to go back to their home country to complete their revolution. The leader of the Jamaican independence movement lived in the French Quarter in exile all through the 1940s. Similar stuff in the 19th century with Nicaragua, and so on and so on. So it's a place where you just never quite know who you're talking to. And that on one end can be a little sinister, a little spooky. On the other hand, it creates a freedom, a creative freedom that is a key ingredient for the literary explosion that's been unfolding here for almost 200 years, I would say. Yeah.
So talking about the artistry of the writers that have been there, but also the voices, like, do you feel like that they were free to voice their own truth, because they were in New Orleans or they had a community in New Orleans. Like, you've spoken about some of the white male authors as well as some of the white female authors, but what about the Black voice, things like that? How has that evolved?
I think absolutely some of the same stuff applies. It's a little bit different, but it seems to me that urban density makes truly draconian slave codes hard to enforce. On a plantation in the middle of nowhere, it can be run in the most brutal and ruthless way. In the complexity of an urban environment, there's just more and more wiggle room. For example, an enslaved person is told by his or her master to go a mile away to buy some pork chops and bring them back for dinner tonight. And it turns out is gone all day. Well, where the heck have you been? Damn it. I ran into a friend of yours who told me that you owe them a favor and I had to do this for them. And then, that shop was closed. So I had to go to the other shop and they said their cousin was out of town. So blah, blah. Next thing you know, the person had a day to do other things. Also, very importantly, the Spanish slave codes, the French gave up on this place about 1760. The Spanish took it over for about 40 years, introduced a completely new slave regime, whereby slaves had the right of self-purchase. They were understood to have souls, and they could sue their masters. So it not just like it literally, you can take your master to court if he or she is treating you badly. If you meet the price that is attached to you, you've got the money, you're free. And they have and the idea that in Spanish codes slaves had souls, all this differed from the French and the Anglo version. That created in New Orleans a kind of a launch pad of creative, innovative incentive to cultivate various kinds of skills, culinary, musical, whatever, to accumulate a few coins at a time. And over 10 or 15 years under the mattress, you've got the $600 you need to purchase your freedom. And this, with the urban density and the Spanish slave codes, create a place where, though God knows it's a slave society, a white supremacist society, it differs from, say, Jackson, Mississippi, or even Mobile, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, Atlanta, because the Spanish and the scale of the urban density creates a sort of wiggle room, and there's financial incentives in place for a free people of color to emerge and gain a certain kind of momentum and speak their truths to power relatively freely. Now, I say relatively freely. In 1830, there was a edict passed: anybody who publishes anything that could cause discontent among the people of color will be sentenced to life at hard labor. Whoa. Interestingly enough, that was the forbidden fruit. That spur put in place basically 150 years of very inspired inquiry and eloquent writing about race here, and specifically the vagaries and degrees of black and white, that great big middle between the binary of black and white. Mm-hmm. That is where Creole Louisiana, Creole New Orleans has blown up. And Jelly Roll Morton and Sidney Bechet all come from that world, a high cultural world of sophisticated music theory, et cetera, that merges with the work chants of the enslaved and the rhythms and it's sort of sanctified trance of the Baptist Church. That is what gives us jazz.
But are there any writings or authors that you could point out to that were the voices of the Black?
Absolutely. Yeah. So definitely 1840s, there's a group, they call themselves Les Senelles. It's the first anthology of African-American poetry ever to exist, published right here in the 1840s. 20 years later, in the 1860s, a group of Afro-Creole poets were publishing radical political verse in these Black-run newspapers that were based in the French Quarter. And then jump to the early 20th century, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Marcus B. Christian, and then Margaret Walker are all major Black voices who were formed by early 20th century New Orleans and then laid the groundwork for an explosion of Black creativity in literature in the 1960s and following, such that Toni Morrison wanted to visit, James Baldwin wanted to visit and did. Baldwin was here quite a bit. I think his grandparents may have been from here, and so he had a root here anyway. But so that is kind of how we got to the present moment, where, quite honestly, all of the most important literary achievement of the last 15 years has been, in my view, Black, and it's coming from the outskirts of the city by Black writers whose childhood and early adulthood was shaped by hurricanes.
Mm-hmm. And you had said the last chapter of the book is about the outskirts.
Absolutely.
And how does that differ from the inskirts?
Yeah, good question. Well, in one very basic way, the old city was on high ground and kind of surrounded by swamps. The outskirts are built on swampland that has been drained. To say that it is precarious, it's more than precarious. We know what's going to happen to the 20th century suburbs that have sprung up along the edges of the old city. In 2005, Mother Nature showed us that wants to be swampland. And all it needs is the right conditions to refill with about 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 feet of water. Houses be damned, schools and malls be damned. It wants to be a swamp, it's going to be a swamp. It will be a swamp again, which is what it was entirely up until about the dawn of the 20th century, when they got together this new technology. It was a Tulane engineering student who figured out this thing. It's called the wood screw pump. And they are still in use all over the city. They've been copied all over the world. It's how you take marshes and wetlands and turn them into buildable modern land, land that can be built upon in contemporary ways. What we're understanding, of course, is that it's a fool's paradise. You can drain this stuff, but not forever. It can be bone dry for 100 years, but that doesn't mean that you solve the problem and the water's coming back. So those outskirts are drained swampland that flooded horrendously in 2005 and probably will flood again soon. That makes life out there very precarious. It also, those outskirts historically as swampland had a huge role in the old city's imagination of itself, because we're surrounded not just by swamps, but those swamps are full of runaway slaves, maroons, pirates, smugglers of various kinds. It's an incredible place to hide out, an impossible place to police, meaning the lawlessness that kind of undergirds the city is really coming from out there in the dark, impenetrable, mysterious swamps, gators and snakes, but also pirates and maroons, outlaws of various kinds. The unknown that plays on the imagination of the people in the kind of European settlement in the old city in ferocious ways. And this becomes, the concern about a massive uprising of the enslaved, such as they had in Haiti. Great anxiety that would happen here, and it would come from the swamps. When the Maroons out in the dark, mysterious swamps organized into a kind of renegade army and swung through here with machetes and took over the city. It nearly happened in 1811, and the threat was constant. And so that's what the outskirts are historically. And what's kind of interesting is today, those outskirts are sponsoring a certain kind of takeover of the city from Black writers. What was long feared and prophesied among the kind of white elites in the French Quarter is coming true today at the level of literary culture, in that the dominant voices are from out in the old swamps, that are now look like any American suburb, except when they got 6, 8, 10, 12 feet of water in them,
Yeah. So what do you think about, I have a question in the Q&A that is a little bit off topic from this. So I'm going to ask this first and then go to that one. What do you think about sort of the romanticizing of New Orleans in writing? Because we think it's a certain way, but the truth is it's probably very different.
Oh God, yeah. It's right after the Civil War that a major generation of writers began to write about this city in a way that became the sort of fundamental themes of the tourist industry: Creole cuisine, interesting music, haunted houses, funky trees with moss. Lafcadio O'Hearn, George Cable, Grace King, Molly Moore Davis, they built the kind of rhetoric of the modern tourist industry in the 1870s and 80s. That stuff got codified and kind of intensified even more so in the 1940s by Lyle Saxon and Robert Tallant and a few others. And part of why I wrote the book that I did was to sort of show that is a very sort of, that romanticizing is a very powerful, it's beautiful writing in many cases. It's gorgeous, it's spellbinding writing, a lot of it, but it is a very limited view of the city as we can comprehend it today, vis-a-vis climate change and our new ways of thinking about race. That there's a whole lot more to talk about here, and therefore there's also generations of major literary activity associated with the city that has nothing to do with the land of dreamy dreams, the line from Basin Street Blues. There's an incredible romance here, and it's been exquisitely articulated by two different generations of writers. But to me, there's so much more to talk about here that has nothing to do with that old romance. Grace King is probably the greatest avatar of that stuff. She wrote in the late 19th century these gorgeous, long, beautiful, very romantic histories of the city without a single reference to slavery. How do you do that? How do you write the history of New Orleans without using the word slave? It's wild. And so, what a friend of mine calls it, the mystic scent of magnolia, that school of thought. It's very real. It's very powerful. It's part of the legacy here, but there's so much more to get into. The history of gangsters here, the stories of music here, the complexities of the political corruption, what Katrina has meant. There's you could spend 10 years of your life studying the Kennedy assassination from the standpoint of the New Orleans gangster underground, which has nothing to do with magnolia blossoms, not a damn thing to do with the mystic scent of magnolias, and everything to do with Cold War era collaborations between the CIA and organized crime, especially the syndicate here, which had a lot of backdoor inroads into Cuba. CIA very eager to take out Castro, going to do it through this back channel mafioso here in New Orleans. And in the machinations of those backroom deals, other kinds of arrangements may have been made that led to the shooting in broad daylight of President of the United States without ever anyone really being convicted of it. And that story. So there's that kind of stuff. There's so much more to get into beyond the mystic scent of magnolia.
Right, the dirty underbelly,
dirty underbelly.
What I want to hear about, I want to hear what is it really about? So is there anybody currently really writing about that underbelly, or has there ever been?
Yes, I think really one of the great American novels of the 1960s, Robert Stone's Hall of Mirrors. Robert Stone went on to have a really extraordinary career through the 70s, 80s, 90s, even he just died a few years ago. But his first novel, 1967, is called A Hall of Mirrors, and it is a breathtaking journey into the very noirish, creepy, paranoid, late night New Orleans, where you're looking over your shoulder all the time and nobody is quite who they appear to be. That is the truth. I've lived here 25 years. That's what New Orleans is. It is a dangerous place, and it is not Disneyland. It's a Washington Post recently ran something about the 10 most murderous cities in the world. 9 of them are in Mexico. The only one that's not in Mexico, New Orleans. It's intense. And I could go on about that in detail, but Robert Stone's Hall of Mirrors in the 60s. In today's time, Zachary Lazar wrote a beautiful novel called Vengeance, which is basically about the Angola Penitentiary and how, about 100 miles northwest of here, just above Baton Rouge, and how 80% of the population of the Angola Penitentiary comes from New Orleans. and the the kind of rough world of New Orleans. We sometimes talk about the school to penitentiary pipeline, and it's a novel of that. How Black New Orleans, especially Black male New Orleans, has this overwhelming riptide leading them to the penitentiary. So Lazar's Vengeance does that. Stone's Hall of Mirrors does it incredibly in the 60s. Those are the first two big ones that come to mind. There's a great book called Desire Street by Jed Horn, which is a portrait of the criminal justice system here. And it's about the Desire housing projects and a horrible murder that grew out of a love triangle, and the wrong guy was on death row for 15 years. And this investigative reporting corrects that failure of justice, but takes you into the police corruption, the judicial corruption, and the way the housing projects are just, very vulnerable place for people to become preyed upon by rogue cops and corrupt judges. A word.
So I'm going to ask the question in the Q&A, and then I'm going to come back to this. Is there any truth to the accusations that Lillian Hellman lied about a lot of things?
Well, I don't know for sure. I think that she had an extraordinary imagination and was a great storyteller. Late in life, she was sued for presenting as nonfiction what was probably more properly understood as fiction. She passed away before the lawsuits could be settled. I don't know, because I don't have any inside knowledge about the people, that she was writing about and arguably misrepresenting, lying about, as it was the charges. And there were people who hated her and talked about and said that she was just a liar. I don't know. She was a extraordinary storyteller, an extraordinary imagination. What interests me about her is the way she talks about having kind of learned those skills growing up in uptown New Orleans. And so weighing in on that case, I just don't feel that I can. What I study about her is her New Orleans life and then the astounding career that followed. I wish I could tell you, but I don't think there was ever a verdict in that legal case because she passed away and the suit was dropped, as I understand it.
Well, maybe we're all liars sometimes.
That's right.
So I want to go back to, we were talking about the underbelly and the writers around that, but what about New Orleans joy? That's always like kind of interesting because like you don't want it to be like that mystic thing. It's sort of that realistic. There is joy in the city. Who's writing about that and who's doing it well?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I feel like, we're just in the aftermath of Katrina, with the reality of climate change, the air of fatalism is, there's a lot of, when I think about the poetry of Charisma Price, hurricane anxiety saturates it. Sky Jackson is so concerned about gentrification. So is Maurice Ruffin. Clint Smith is writing about legacies of slavery. The joy, I think where the joy is in the music. And when people write about the music or musicians write their memoirs, that's where you find the joy. And I would say something I want to mention here is in the book, I define the concept of literature very kind of broadly. Anybody who is making art with words is fair game to be in my book, meaning the greatest vocalists of the city's musical traditions are in here. The greatest songwriters are in here. And whenever a musician wrote a particularly brilliant memoir, they're in here. So I've talked a lot about Armstrong's memoir. It's an amazing book. Jelly Roll Morton's memoir, Sidney Bechet's memoir. I write a lot about Mahalia Jackson, Johnny Adams, a little bit about Dr. John. Anybody who is doing serious stuff with words, be it on the written page or on a microphone or in a musical composition or in a memoir, I'm calling literature and putting in here. And that's where you find the joy. The joy in Armstrong is legitimately mystical, it seems to me. and Bichet's memoir, it's explicitly mystical. That there are spirit, and Jelly Roll Morton is consumed with voodoo. The spirits are on me, taking me places. I'm just a vehicle. I'm just a message. The spirits are working through me. The spirits of my enslaved ancestors specifically, whose joy in my freedom is beyond language. I can only express it with a horn or a drum or a keyboard. That's where the joy is, in the musical legacy and in the language that swirls around the musical legacy.
Well, Bess says in the
Big Frida, and Lil Wayne, but especially Big Frida, the joy in her lover was murdered on Valentine's night, and she had a gig he was murdered that afternoon. She had a gig that night, did not cancel the gig, went to the gig and danced. It's alleged she danced all night like possessed because the love of her life had been murdered hours earlier.
Wow. So Bess actually adds something that's really interesting to me about the joy of food, because New Orleans is obviously known for its food. I could go for a chicory coffee right this second and a good beignet. So is that, is that part of the cultural joy of New Orleans? Not the food, of course it is, but like, how does it all play together for people to write about this incredible culture in New Orleans?
Well, it's so true. I mean, the food is an anchor of the culture every bit as much as the music is. And so part of what I did, I didn't go deep into the food writing, but I do mention some. Jessica B. Harris, whom a lot of people know from High on the Hog, really probably the premier food writer of the foodways of the African diaspora. She keeps a house in New Orleans and is here all the time, going to restaurants and stuff and writing here. And this is a great place to study the foodways of African America. Lacadio Hearn, very importantly, when he in the 19th century writing about Creole culture, step one was to make a cookbook. It's like, to give you an idea of how different this world is, we got to talk about how they eat. And the food is this miracle of taste and joy and innovation, but it's the kind of stuff that most people in America might not want to eat. Crawfish, their other term is they're mud bugs. They are bugs that live in the mud. Where I come from, we had crawfish. I would no more eat one of those things. But here, my God, you can put 5 pounds in front of me and I'm not going to stop till they're gone. They are bugs. Unambiguously, they are bugs that live in mud. And my God, in the springtime with a cold beer, I'm telling you, I'll eat as many as you put in front of me.
Love it.
And it's a cultural thing. It's a very social thing. You never eat crawfish alone. It's always a group of people hovering over a table and, but the writing about it, it's tricky. Jessica Harris is really important. Lacadio Hearn is really important on that. But I didn't go much farther than those two, except to say these are the sort of historic poles by which you could kind of set up a literary discourse of the centrality of culinary art to the cultural treasure that is this place.
So we're almost out of time. I just want to ask one question. I believe that Where the Crawdad Sings was set in New Orleans, or it's Louisiana.
I think it is Louisiana, maybe Carolinas, but I think it's rural Louisiana.
I think so too. And for people who are here that have read it, please chime in and let me know if I'm wrong, because I'm just wondering if, let's say it was, and has there been like a resurgence of more books written by New Orleans writers or written set in New Orleans in the last 10, 15 years? I
think there has. Again, Katrina put this place, brought the world's attention to this place in a way that was a huge stimulus to the writers. I sometimes half jokingly say there was a flood in the city of water followed by a flood of writing, rhetoric, argument, analysis, grief, lamentation, memoir. There was a literary flood, a flood of books that followed the literal flood of waters. And we are in, I think, one of the great chapters of the city's literary history. There's been a number of sort of peak sort of summits of major productivity here. The 1920s were really important. The 1940s were really important. The 60s were very important. The 1860s were very important for obvious reasons. And we're in one now. The post-Katrina time is extraordinary. A fact I stumbled upon that is worth sharing: tourist industry. In the years between Hurricane Katrina and the COVID-19 pandemic, we were averaging, a city of 500,000 people, again, 500,000 people, was hosting 18 million visitors a year. 18 million visitors a year to a city of 500,000 people. A tourist industry roaring on that scale. They want something to read. There's got to be stuff at the airport bookstore that people want to take home, and they get caught up in how fascinating this place is, and they want to start reading about it. And writers and publishing houses are looking for New Orleans stuff because it's a serious subject, a very important subject. There was a phase of Katrina fatigue, but it was short and light and past, and the New Orleans mania is still robust. I mean, there's so many great young writers happening in the city right now. Margaret Wilkerson is another one I haven't mentioned yet. She wrote a beautiful story called A Kind of Freedom, a novel called A Kind of Freedom, Margaret Wilkerson. So there's an explosion going on right now. And I'd like to think that my book is of a piece with that. And I specifically kind of think about the incredible importance of writing about this place, given that there will come a time when this city exists only on the printed page, only in the human imagination, because the ocean and the river are going to take it from us. It will not exist. It will be like Atlantis. It will be a mythical thing that exists in the human imagination, that exists on the printed page and nowhere else. And that's why the literature of the city is so profoundly important, and that we organize it and read it and think about it and discuss it. That's what my book sought to do. A great big gathering up of, this is the stuff, y'all, when this place doesn't exist anymore and you want to read about it and wonder about what it was, here's the stuff you need. And it's I probably talk about 150 writers in this new book, and it skews heavily into the 20th and 21st century, but what I'm actively engaged in the primary roots that precede that, the key stuff, the key early stuff. But what this place has meant in literary culture, the stuff that it has inspired or that people who are from here have gone on to do, is so substantial. And it's really important given that the city will exist nowhere else within a generation.
So that segues beautifully into my second to last question, which is, what was your favorite piece of literature that came out of New Orleans?
Oh boy, that's a tough one.
I know.
Can I give you my top 20? I'll say this. How this all started for me, I was an undergraduate in Chicago and I was a creative writing major, and I'd written a short story. I don't even know what it was about or what made my teacher say this, but she said to me, TR, it was fall semester. When you go home for the fall semester, I want you to read Robert Stone's Hall of Mirrors. That's your assignment. I'm like, what? Who is Robert Stone? What is Hall of Mirrors? She goes, just go to the bookstore and buy it and take it home and read it. Let's talk about it when you come back in the spring. So I did. And it really cast a spell on me. It's, I was saying earlier, it has nothing to do with, the mystic scent of magnolia and all that old romance. It is a journey into a noirish nightlife, paranoid, creepy, complicated, racially charged, conspiratorial, beatniks in the French Quarter getting caught up in things that are bigger and scarier than they are. And I was in love with it. And that was how my interest in New Orleans as a subject and as a reading experience could lead you into began. And so for sort of sentimental and personal reasons, I'll say Robert Stone's Hall of Mirrors is my favorite, because that's where it all started for me. And I still teach it all the time and I still love it. I don't think I've ever read a book that conjures the atmosphere of a city, the smell and the texture and the vibe, the way Robert Stone did it in Hall of Mirrors in 67.
The only thing I don't like about that story is your teacher should have told you to go to the library to get it.
That's right.
I love that. So,
Thank
last question is,
Mhm.
are you working on any other books now?
I'm trying. I've been jokingly, having done these 2 books on New Orleans, I'm kind of been jokingly telling people, but my goal is to be the laziest man in Louisiana. A high bar, but I'm after it. I'm gonna get there. That said, oddly enough, the intensity of the work on this last book has gotten me into the habit of writing. And I've been writing a lot of poems. I just wake up in the morning with like a poem in my head. And I've been doing that for about a year. And I have a sort of a book of poetry now that I think I'm going to try to find a publisher for. I feel like a lot of it's good enough that I'm going to try for that. But Cambridge wants me to do a 3rd book, basically of teaching resources. This 3rd one would be just teaching resources for people who teach classes around New Orleans themes. And I think I'll probably do that, but I'm not in a big hurry to get it done. I'm playing a lot of saxophone. My creative life is kind of veering into the saxophone kind of hard these last 6 or 8 months. And that's what I did all morning. Being a professor, I kind of have a little bit of leisure time in the summer. So I'm just living in the saxophone and a little bit of poetry, and not going to rush to the next thing, but I'm going to write some more stuff. Just haven't quite nailed down what that would be yet. But thank you for asking.
Whatever it is, we will look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, TR. This has really been fascinating for me, and I know for people that are here. So I really appreciate everybody that spent their hour with us. And TR, we will look forward to more from you in the future. And I really, really appreciate you really digging into this topic with us tonight.
My absolute pleasure. Thank all of you all for being here. Mina, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate everybody being here and listening. And if you happen to pick up the book, I really, really hope you enjoy it. If you want to email me, I'd be happy to share. I'm at trj@tulane.edu, trj@tulane.edu. And I do my radio show, wwoz.org, every Tuesday, be 5 to 8 o'clock p.m. in your all's time zone. So check me out on the radio, or shoot me an email if you want to talk about the book once you start reading it.
Excellent. I will include the email address in the recap email I sent out to everybody. So yeah, that's really very generous of you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, you guys. Have a great evening.
You too. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.